photograph is one of my favorites, and it's one of the oldest things I have, and that is a photograph of the Rappahannock Industrial Academy baseball team from 1930. The Rappahannock Industrial Academy was one of the Negro academies put in place by the Baptist Church when there were no public high schools in rural Virginia for black folk. And so, of course, as we've always done, we took care of business. My father, in fact, my whole family, my father, his 8 siblings, my grandfather, everybody went to our academy. But that picture I found in my father's papers, and it's my father. Okay, I have no pointer, so in the center of the middle is my father, and then on the middle left is my father's brother. And let's see, the second person on the back row, the second person from the left is J. Murray Brooks of Matthews County. And some of you may know that name. He was the brother of Lyman Beecher Brooks, who ended up being the provost and then the president of the state. Anyway, the little legend says that our academy baseball team of 1930, the team that could not be beat. And just a little piece about that. So the R Academy was not accredited at that time. And of course, you know, there was the Gloucester Academy first, and the people in Middlesex and Essex and King and Queen supported the Gloucester Academy at Capahosic, but then they wanted something closer. So this was in Essex County, and that was the Southside Rappahannock Baptist Association, which is Essex, Middlesex, King and Queen, at that point, northern Gloucester, and a little bit over Lancaster. But at any rate, the school wasn't accredited. So when they finished, in order to go on to college, they still had to go on. And so my father and his brother went down to Fine Institute in Chase City, which was a boarding school, and did high school again. My mother did high school again at Virginia State High School on the campus of Virginia State. But anyway, moving on, just a little tidbit about that picture. Next slide. Okay, so what we want to get rid of is the notion that African Americans can't do genealogy, that all the records were destroyed, all these notions out there, so we can't do it. So there's more there than most of us could do in a lifetime. Virginia itself, I mean, Virginia is wonderful. Library of Virginia is wonderful, and I don't say that and do the commercial for them just because I'm on the foundation board, but it really is. And when I had, it was a time when I'd only done research in Virginia, and then I went to Annapolis, and oh my, we are fortunate in Virginia. We've got wonderful, wonderful records in the Library of Virginia as our state archive is a treasured resource. So there's all kinds of things. Census records, vital records, which are birth, marriage, death, wills and estate inventories. You know, we were property, so we may be listed in an estate inventory. Plantation records, manumission papers, Freedmen's Bureau and Freedmen's Bank records, free Negro papers, all kinds of things. Next slide. Okay, so as you get started with this, you want to get some system. See that stack of papers? Well, that's how your whole office can look like very quickly if you don't get some organization. So it's the kind of system that works for you. You know, you decide whether you're going to maintain your files electronically, hard copy. I am a firm believer that you must do both. Please, I get really, really nervous when somebody says, oh, I have my family tree in the cloud and I don't keep paper anymore. Oh, please. Anyway, if you're going to do it electronically, and I suggest that you do, figure out what software works for you. You know, there are many packages out there that are free online kinds of things. I happen to use Family Tree Maker, and I like that software. It talks to Ancestry.com, and so you can sync your files back and forth. And so, but you know, find out what works for you. And then you're going to have all kinds of ways that you have to keep up with what you have done. You need to source it. You need to know where you've searched, where you haven't searched, and where you got information from. So when I started 50 years ago, I really didn't know that. So I have things that I wrote down, and I have no clue who told me, or when, or how. And so learn from my mistakes on that. So you have family group sheets, ancestor charts, research logs, and all of these things are online that you can find quite readily. Next slide. Okay, so it's actually quite simple. You start with what you know. And you would be surprised. You say, well, I don't know anything. And I have people say, oh, I don't know. You know, everybody's dead. I don't know anything. Nobody left in the records. Well, write down, start with yourself. Write down everything you know about yourself, your parents, your grandparents, if you know. Now, sometimes someone has been adopted and you really don't know, but write down all that you do know and go back as far as you can. And even if you say, well, there was Aunt Sue, and I'm not sure how she was connected, but write her name down and come back to it later and you probably will figure it out. You want to include full names of everyone, first, middle, last, dates of birth, dates and places of birth, marriage, death, and also jot down what you know or think you know. I think Aunt Grace was the one who made the best pumpkin pie in the county. Whatever it is, jot it down. Next slide. Okay, now this is the fun part. It's all fun. So go on a treasure hunt, and you'd be surprised what you have in your own possession. You probably got newspaper articles, you've got funeral programs, and you know how we do, Black folk do funeral programs. In fact, I didn't know until we started the funeral programs project. There was a collaboration with Family Search, probably about 15 years ago. I didn't know that the way we do funeral programs was kind of a Black folk thing. I really didn't know that until I had trouble convincing Family Search that these funeral programs are valuable. You know, let's collaborate on that. They weren't familiar with what I was talking about. And finally, we got a new person. And actually, at the time, the Black History Museum in Richmond was working with Family Search to transcribe the Virginia Freedmen's Bureau records. So we were working on that with Family Search. And finally, somebody listened to what I was saying about those funeral programs. They said, all that? I said, oh yeah, all that and more. And so the guy said, well, can you send me one tonight? He said, it so happens that we've got a crew at the Virginia Historical Society, is what it was called then, that's going to be photographing things, and maybe we can get your materials in. So I go home, scan a couple of funeral programs, send them, don't hear anything. 3 weeks later, I hear from the guy. He says, you're in. I said, okay. But you got to have all your funeral programs into the Virginia Historical Society in 4 weeks. Anyway, that's a whole other story. But we got in 10,600 funeral programs, and they're now on Family Search. And when you search Ancestry, you find out Virginia African American Funeral Programs Project. Anyway, funeral programs, so baptism certificates, anything and everything. Next slide. Okay, now it goes on. Diaries, journals, letters, even addressed envelopes. Look at the postmark, look at the return address. You might not have what is in that envelope, but maybe you find deep in that dresser drawer of the envelope that might give you a clue to the area that someone migrated. Yearbooks, all kinds of heirlooms, military, maybe those discharge papers are stuck in a drawer somewhere. Deeds, just any and everything. You would be surprised when you look through houses that have been inhabited over generations. You will find all kinds of things. And then when you get through searching your own house, then do anybody in your circle that will let you in their house to do it. Next slide. So you want to visit what I call living libraries. These are the people in your circle. They may be your relatives, they may be your neighbors. Your neighbors know a lot. So you want to visit all those folks and try to interview them. I know you all have been doing oral histories this week. Sometimes it works, and oral histories are always good to do, but sometimes if you bring somebody in and sit them down, they get kind of uptight, and you're asking questions, they answer you in monosyllables. And so sometimes you might have to do it just a little bit more informally. And I found out that different people in the family remember different things. I have a cousin who is a year older than I am, and she knows so much more than I know for two reasons. That 1 year, but she was raised by our great aunt. So she was raised by a generation before, and although that great aunt was only about 10 years older than my mother, I mean, the base of knowledge is really different. So you want to talk to everybody, and sometimes you may have somebody younger. Like I get things from my daughter, and that is because when I was growing up, of course my parents were working, busy. By the time my daughter came along, and she'd come from Richmond and spend 3 weeks in Middlesex County with my parents in the summertime, they had nothing to do but talk to her, take her around. She knows so many people born in the 19th century. So I ask her a lot of things I need to know. Next slide. All right, sometimes it helps to get two people together. We found that they have kind of a synergistic effect one on the other. One helps the other. Remember, they kind of aid and abet each other. And so that is a person on our history ministry of my church, which is Angel Visit Baptist Church, and he's interviewing two elders who were probably about 2 years apart in age, grew up in the same community, so they were really able to help each other and just come up with all kinds of things. And sometimes when you ask a direct question, the answer isn't there. An example is my grandmother had tuberculosis. Fortunately, she survived. She was in Fairfield Sanatorium, and I always asked, when was that? My mother didn't remember. So one day we were talking, and my mother had this long cut that just went all up and down her arm, and she had horrible looking stitches. I mean, the way they, I guess, sewed up a cut in 1918 or whatever the year was. It was actually a little bit 1920 something. And so one day she told me what happened. So the girls and boys were playing a tug of war with some kind of string, and each side's pulling against the other side. So the boys let the rope go. The girls fall back into the window, and that's how my mother, and it's a wonder she didn't bleed to death. I mean, we talk about back up in the woods in Essex County in Osina, long away from any medical care, no phone, of course. Anyway, thank goodness I'm here. She survived, I'm here. So I said, well, where on earth is your mother? Because I figured my grandfather was out farming, and my grandmother was a teacher. I think it was the summertime, so she was home. I said, so where was your mother with all this rough play? She was in Burkeville. Aha, how old were you? You were 13. So now we have a sense of when my grandmother was in the sanatorium. But when I asked her, she had no clue. Next slide. And don't delay those visits. I had one of my cousins, one of my white cousins in Saluda said to me last fall, she said, don't wait. Come see Mama, don't wait. And I didn't. And Mama left in January. So don't wait. This is just an example. As you start to, folks think, oh, I don't have to go to the library anymore. I don't have to go to the archive. Everything is online. Well, that's my assessment of how much is online. It's like the tip of the iceberg. So don't get me wrong, it's wonderful. We were talking the other day, 25 years ago, the only way you could get census records Library of Virginia had Virginia and a couple of neighboring states. That was it. You wanted the census records, you had to go to the National Archives. So now, at 3 a.m. when you should be asleep, you can be doing it on Ancestry.com or Family Search. So online is wonderful, shaves hours and hours and days off, but is far from the be it all in and be all. Next slide. So some of the places you search, and I always tell people to start online, because you can start with Ancestry. Ancestry has millions and millions of records. An Ancestry subscription is worth its weight in gold. But if you're not sure, then your library probably has an Ancestry Library Edition. I know that the Middlesex Public Library does. I think the Rappahannock Community College Library does. I'm not sure about your Gloucester Library, but of course you've got a Family Search Center at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints here in Gloucester. I know there was a couple of years ago. So all of those places, state archives, local archives, your county and city courthouses, university special collections, and you just have to keep an open mind. We found the papers of this wonderful couple from Urbana who have so much to do with African American church and school history. Their papers at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I'm not sure why, but they are. So keep an open mind. Historical societies. Someone was telling me yesterday, and I've not been to the, I don't know what they call it, the Virginiana room at the Gloucester Public Library. This person was telling me that there are family trees on all the old families of Gloucester that are in the library. So you want to, anywhere their records might be, most anywhere. Next slide. Okay, so you really, and I would say this to scare anybody away, but in order to do this effectively, you need to know a lot. You need to know the history of the area that you're researching, the history of the region and beyond. You need to learn to look at maps, look at the geography, was there a mountain that people had to get over? What were the boundaries? Boundaries have changed. And I can tell you, like in the area that I research a lot, I happen to know that, and you need to know, that Essex and Richmond County were old Rappahannock County back when. And those records, of course, Rappahannock County today is somewhere way away, it's not near, but those records are housed in Essex for old Rappahannock County. So those are just the little tidbits you have to know when King and Queen and New Kent split off. And then just, we were looking at something, Central State Hospital, which is the Central State Hospital for the Central Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane. But anyway, it was in Dinwiddie County. And so if you didn't know that, and you're looking at Petersburg, then, and of course we were looking at Richmond, we looked at Quinn, the city of Richmond now, when and certain parts of Henrico were annexed, when certain parts of Chesterfield, when the city of Manchester, which is South Richmond, became Richmond. And so all of that you really need to know, the boundary lines. The old place names are just amazing. In other words, and I don't know Gloucester, but you need to know that there was a place in Essex County called Upright, Nathaniel, and I've done some work there. I think there's probably still a green sign that says that, but some of those old places are not on Google, so or not on maps or whatever you're looking at. But in fact, on our Genealogy Society website, and I did bring some brochures, so don't let me forget that. We have a directory of old place names, because you may have those old place names in your family oral history. You may have the old place names in an old census or just anywhere. And so you need to know that. And then migrations, forced migrations and voluntary migrations. You need to really learn a lot about the domestic slave trade if you're doing African American genealogy. Professor Phil Troutman, who's a professor at George Washington University, says that, I guess it's about 30 or 40 years in the 19th century, and I don't remember exactly which ones, about 1/3 of the black folk from this part of the state were sold to the plantation south. So what that means is you got a lot of cousins down in the plantation south, whether they will walk the 1,000 miles to New Orleans, or whether they were, there were folks on the train on April 3rd, 1865, folks waiting at the train station to be shipped out. And so I know that most of us are getting a lot of DNA matches in the Deep South, in South Carolina, Georgia, and of course Virginia had figured out that we were their cash crop. And of course they figured out early on that it was much cheaper to grow your own Negroes than to import them. So you need to know. And of course, one of the things great about some of the voluntary migration is for us, and I'm not trying to say this is easy, but we kind of went straight up the coast. I don't know how many of you have read. If you haven't, read Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which she talks about these 3 migration streams that African Americans followed. You know, the one straight up the coast is what we did. The one from the deep south to all the Midwestern cities, and then the one that's talked about in that film with Danny Glover, To Sleep with Anger, when the families moved from, I don't know if it was Texas or Louisiana to Southern California. So know those migration streams. Of course, when we have missed someone, then it's pretty predictable. I mean, you know, they're always outliers. I mean, somebody left and went to Chicago. I mean, I know a man from a Tuskegee Airman from Saluda went to Chicago. So always somebody did that. But by and large, the migration was pretty predictable. And once you got like Locust Hill, which is a community in Middlesex, everybody went to Plainfield, New Jersey. And so, you know, just look for your folk there. I was looking for my Montague family from King and Queen. And all these Montagues and King and Queen in the 19th century, 1900, by 1910, they're thinning out. Where did they go? So I started to look in, and this was early, maybe about 25 years ago. I guess I went to whatever online and just put in Montague, that surname, in Philadelphia. It's only about maybe 40, 50. So I started calling them all. And do you know that I found somebody, and of course this was before people were getting such many crank calls, so you know, most folks would talk to me. I found somebody in my family who migrated from King and Queen County on that cold call, so very, very predictable. Next slide. Okay, so one of the things you might do, I always say start with the 1950 census. Now, even if you weren't born in 1950, then your parent was probably born, or your grandparent. So, of course, the federal census is every 10 years. So I always say start with 1950 and work back. And then you're going to fill in, you know, looking for all the Bible records, military records, cemetery records. Find the grave is wonderful, although not always accurate. And, you know, anything that you find in writing, you have to take with a grain of salt and make sure that it is accurate. But you're just going to get started on searching and write down everything you find and where you found it so that you have a source. Next slide. Okay, so you may find, as I did, I'm in the 1950 census twice. And so what that means is somebody didn't follow the instructions, and each census has a different set of instructions, but they weren't always followed. So at the top, I'm 2 years old. I'm in the town of Urbana where we live with my parents. But my parents were working during the week. And so I spent the 5 days a week in Essex with my grandparents and was home on the weekends. So someone went to do the census, and there I am, the second hour, my second time in the census, and there I'm enumerated with my grandparents. Now, if you follow the instructions, I should have been only enumerated the ones with my parents, but there I am. So I'm, you know, it was exciting when you get to the point the census is public 72 years after it's taken, so you're always waiting to see yourself in the first census that you find yourself. Next slide. So then you want to just keep going back, and you'll keep expanding, and you'll be adding, you know, you'll be going straight back, you'll be going collaterally, and that you're adding your aunts and uncles, and, you know, just expanding and keeping on. Now, you should find, in theory, everyone at least back to 1870. And so for those persons who were enslaved, were not going to be listed before 1870. And so there are some, if someone was free, then they should be listed. And in most of these counties, there was a fairly substantial free Negro community. But you want to just keep going. And I will say that you can find your white people. And, you know, everybody has white people, everybody pretty much, if you've been here a while. But it's like, in many instances, we don't know who our white people are. But if you know who your white people are, you can probably find them. And then you may be able to figure out who they are. And even if they're not your relatives, one basic principle is you have to research white people to find black people. I mean, just that's the way it is. So, and there are other schedules. There's an agriculture schedule. There's a mortality schedule. In some years, like 1880, tells you who died that year. There's an 1890 veteran census. So there are other enumerations that you may want to look at instead of it. And the census records give different things. And so some of them give like 1900. They may tell you, well, they do tell you how many children a woman has had and how many of those children are still living. And that's, you learn a lot from that. And my great-great-grandmother, as far as I knew, she'd had 11, and she said she's had 14. And of course that, but what I'm thinking is perhaps 3 died in infancy. Next slide. Okay, so this is a birth record, and you really can't see it, but this is actually a delayed birth record. And what it is for whatever reason, Virginia started keeping vital records in 1853. They stopped keeping them in 1896. So between 1896 and 1912, we had this hole that we don't know when anybody was born and when they died. I mean, it is amazing that they stopped. At any rate, this is my father's delayed birth certificate. I always knew, before I even started doing research, when that happened, because my father was born in May of 1912. He did not have a birth certificate. My mother was born in September. She had one. Law changed June 1. And so this was the product of my mother's working in the 1950s to come up with a delayed birth certificate for my father. And of course, he was lucky enough at that point, he had an aunt still living who could attest to when he was born, and she was there, and who his parents were. And then you had to go, remember those census records are private, but you can get your own records. So she had to write to the Census Bureau in Manhattan, Kansas, and okay, we need this little boy, Randolph White, who was enumerated in 1920, and he's 8 years old, and so on. So that's, but your birth certificate, in theory, gives the name of your parents, and including your mother's birth name. I don't like to use that term, maiden name, but the birth name of the mother. So that's one of the kinds of records you want to find, as many as you can. Of course, in that period, you will not be able to. Next slide. Okay, marriage records, and what it's, you see, I was so naive because I'd only researched Virginia, and oftentimes it's that marriage record, particularly people getting married in the 1860s and 1870s, often it's the parents' names on that marriage record, maybe the only tie you have to the generation before. I was able, with my Montague family, I did not know the identity of my great-grandfather's siblings, but those marriage records, there are 4 people who got married in King and Queen County who had the same Montague parents. So that's how I figured out how I was able to put that family together. And so I foolishly thought that all states did that. So I was trying to help a friend, and I want to move this along, get a record from Washington, D.C. And so I go there. It's really horrible because I'm standing in the same line for this marriage record from 1900 with people who are trying to get their marriage record from year before last. And finally, they put me somewhere and give me a microfilm reader. And I get the marriage record, and guess what? I learned they got married. No parents' names. And so, that Virginia is wonderful, believe me. Another thing that you can't assume is Virginia's really started keeping records. I mean, those marriage records started way back, get all those records from 1853. So I was trying to figure out my husband's great-grandparents' names. No, his double greats I'm trying to figure out. So I figured I'll just get the marriage record of the greats, and then several problems with that. South Carolina didn't mandate statewide marriage records since 1915. I'm needing a marriage record from the 1880s. So, I'm sure South Carolina has some advantages, but that's not enough. But anyway, the marriage records are wonderful. And it's interesting. So, you figure that the marriage record is probably pretty accurate for when they got married, maybe bride and groom's names. You figure, they should have known their parents' names. So it's interesting, this is my mother's maternal grandparents. And he says that his mother's name is Eliza, and Eliza Smith. Now his name is Thomas Smith. No father listed, so did he not know who his father was, perhaps? Anyway, next slide. This is his death record. The same man's death record, and all of a sudden, there's another mother listed. Her name is Lucy Smith, and a father whose name is also Thomas Smith. Now, what to make of that? I mean, he apparently only knew that his mother was Eliza, so I don't know whether she was Lucy Eliza or Eliza Lucy, but it's like, who was left? The death records for background information like that are only as accurate as the person left behind knows or can remember. So to take it with a grain of salt. Next slide. So this is the death certificate for one of the children of the couple that was getting married. And that's Thomas Smith and his wife, Mariah. So on that, and this was in 1937, he died of tuberculosis, my grandmother's brother. And the question was, decedent's mother's maiden name. So they answered Mariah Lockley, and these are folks from Mascot and King County. And so, interestingly enough, when another brother died in 1955, the same answer was given. When my grandmother died in 1965, my mother was the informant. She gives the same answer. Guess what? It's all wrong. Oh, her name was Mariah Spencer all day long. I found her in the census records. She got married as Mariah Spencer. She's even got a father named Joseph Spencer. So that was her name. For whatever reason, and she died when the children were young, they all thought that her birth name was Lockley. And so it's my job to figure out why they thought that, and I haven't been able to figure that out. I'm sure there was a very good reason. But anyway, those are just golden. Next slide. Okay, so this is an example of a military record that's really informative, so that men had to register, draft registration, World War I and World War II, and even, I guess it's World War II at least, there was an old man's registration. I don't remember the names. You get people 60 years old maybe who had to register. But this is my grandfather's registration, my paternal grandfather from World War I. And what is interesting that I learned from this is he's working as a farmhand in South Jersey. I never knew that. I knew that my grandmother died when my father was 3. My grandfather, I don't know, but he never started college, but after his wife died, he had the 2 babies. He went to college, became a teacher and preacher and all that. So, but he was working on the truck farms in South Jersey to make it during the summertime, and so that's where he was. So that was interesting, and it gives me his signature, which I have actually a whole collection of sermons that he wrote in longhand. So I do have his handwriting. And what is interesting, he says his heritage is African, which I thought that was really progressive for World War I registration. And of course these draft registration cards are on Ancestry. Next slide. And of course one of the things that's in there too is it asks you who is it who will always know how to get in touch with you, is one of the questions asked. And then you get descriptions. Some of them have whether the person, of course the choices for skin color are most extremely limited, to say the least, and so it's not particularly descriptive for African Americans, because when they say dark, they mean Arab dark or something. But anyway, but they are really informative. So newspaper articles. You might think, well, black folks didn't get covered in the paper. Well, we didn't get covered the way we should have been. We didn't get our due, but it doesn't mean that we weren't written about in the newspaper. The newspaper article on the left is one that I found, this is little piece of paper in my grandmother's Bible. And it's cut out, people cut out newspaper articles. They don't cut out the date. They don't cut out the publication. So all I know is, and that is an obituary for Thomas Smith, my great-grandfather, whose marriage record and death record you saw. And he's referred to as Uncle Tom, a worthy citizen example of his race. I mean, it is just an amazing thing. And I think my mother never saw it because she would have been complaining about it, but I just happened to find it in this Bible. And it says he's survived by something like 18 grandchildren. Well, I only know of about 8 or 9 or 10. Anyway, so it's just that. And we don't know what paper that was in, because I've been working with the people at Virginia Chronicle, which is Library of Virginia's newspaper collection, and they don't have, for the papers that this might be, they don't have those papers for March of 1917, so we're not sure what paper it was. But it says he died at his home near here, and so wherever this paper was, whether it was West Point or where it was near Mascot in King County. And this one on the right, a fellow researcher found, it is an obituary for my great-great-grandmother, and she died. What we knew is that she was alive in 1910, and her husband's widowed. I mean, she was alive in 1900. Her husband is widowed in 1910 because she got no death records in there, and she was buried at the home place back in the woods, no permanent marking of anything. But this lets us know when she died, and this was the Southside Sentinel in Urbana, and she lived at King and Queen Courthouse, but apparently there was a King and Queen column in the paper that said what was going on in King and Queen, but that's how we found that. Of course, she's described as Mrs. Robert Waller, and she was, she didn't have not much of a public persona, but there was an obituary for her, so you never know what you might be able to find. So live on Virginia Chronicle. And then just so much, next slide, so much in terms of newspapers. This is research I was doing. I have this cousin, I guess she'd be my second cousin once removed, whose father left King and Queen, it was my great-grandfather's brother, left King and Queen and moved to Nova Scotia. And Portia had a statue in Nova Scotia as a contralto, much like Mary Anderson's statue here. And so, all kinds of information. We found so much. There's this database called ProQuest Historical Black Newspapers. You can access it through Library of Virginia with your Library of Virginia library card. So all you have to do as a Virginia resident is go online, get a library card, and then you can access that. And it's a database of about 10 black newspapers around the country. And you would be surprised. We found Virginia State College news in the Pittsburgh black paper. So you just never know, but you can do a search. But we found just so much material when we headed to Family Reunion. Next slide. Move down. This DNA is another lecture, but it is an important tool. I suggest that you do DNA testing. It's not a be-all, end-all. Some folks say, oh, I do my DNA and I don't have to do it in research. No. Do your DNA, test as many of your family members as you can, because the only people who are the same are identical twins, triplets. You are different from your sibling if you're not identical. So you want to test as many people as possible. Particularly, you want to get the earlier generations. Because if I'm researching the surname White, which is my father's name, then my father and my uncle, his brother, are going to have more white DNA than I do because I'm diluted, if you will, with my mother. So you want to look to those earlier generations, and when the DNA that you do on Ancestry, 23andMe, is autosomal DNA. It's looking at your whole makeup. When that became available, both my parents were deceased. But so my thing was to get that one uncle, he's a half uncle, my father's half brother, get all the people of my father's generation. Some are his first cousins, some are his second cousins. On my mother's side, she had one, she was an only child, one first cousin left. We got that person, then we had to go to my generation, but you want to. And by getting, I probably have tested probably 65 descendants of a couple, Andrew and Isabella White, who were born in the 1820s and 1830s. With that many people tested, when a match comes up, then it's pretty easy for me to, on some level, to figure out at least which direction in which they might be related. The main thing about DNA, forget the ethnicity, forget whether you should be wearing a lederhosen or a kilt, that's always commercial. Forget whether the gaylet is the most wonderful hat you ever had, it may be, but what is important is finding the genealogically relevant relatives. And so that's the importance of DNA. Let's move on. I mentioned the major testing companies, Autosomal, Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA. Family Tree DNA is the only one that does mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA. So you probably remember hearing that only men can do it. Well, that's what, when Y chromosome first came out, what they were testing, and still are with Y chromosome, is that DNA that's father to son to father to son, unbroken line. So only men can do that. With women, with mitochondrial, men get mitochondrial from their mothers, but they don't pass it on. So just an example is with the Jefferson DNA, what they were able to determine is that Sally Hemings' descendants have Jefferson DNA. So they are Jefferson males. Now, whether Thomas Jefferson is the one, or his brother, or his father, or his son, but what they're looking at is, I can remember, and I am not a Hemings scholar, but they're looking at when Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings were in Paris, so likely he's the one. But anyway, that is, and that can be important. Most of us who are very serious about this have done the mitochondrial, we've done the Y. We found out which male relatives that we want to do the Y. And what I've learned, and you can go on to the next slide, when I do the Y in that Thomas Smith's family, it's European Y. And so what that means is that some European man who came from probably fathered that Y. And so in my father's family, the Y is African. And then, interestingly enough, when I do the mitochondrial, which is the mother to daughter, mine is Asian. And it's not the usual group of people. It's a very narrow group of people that came across the Bering Strait into the Americas, and mostly all the way down to South America. In fact, there's an academic in Argentina who's studying my mitochondrial, so I said, have on. I love it. Anyway, so I just want to say this quickly. Cousins Explain. If you're going to do this, you have to get this. And there's a handout. Do we have a handout, Sarah? Yeah. Okay, Cousins Explain. When I say somebody's my second cousin 3 times removed, you have to know what that is in order for any of this to make sense to you. And so know your first cousin's child is not your second cousin. That's the common error. My mother would get so upset when somebody said that. The first cousin's child is your first cousin once removed. And it's really mathematical. And I want to move on because I know we don't have much time. So, got Cousins Explain. The next slide is just to give you some idea. When you're talking about researching your ancestors, and we talk about how many are genealogically relevant, you go from you, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. I mean, you got how many generations? You got 1 million people in 20 generations. And of course, there's what we call pedigree collapse, because there weren't that many people around. And so you're going to get to some of the same people that double up in your tree. But just do understand that. Next slide. Okay, this is something you can't see, but I invited one of my cousins to come here. And I have to walk over here and see if I can see this. But we have figured out that we are, where am I? We are 7 cousins once removed. And this is a cousin of mine, where he is today, Steve Greaves. I don't know how many of you know him, but he is connected to Roswell. And we started to talk, and we realized that we came from the same people. And so our common ancestor is Elizabeth Warner Lewis from Warner Hall. It's something like my 6th great grandmother, and I think maybe she's his 7th. I know we're about the same age, but we're different generations. But that's what's possible when you know your people, which unfortunately, and this angers me every time I can do that with my white relatives. I can, as long as I've been doing this, I can't go back on anybody black before maybe 1760 or so. So anyway, it is what it is. But that's how Steve and I have worked out, and then we put his daughter and my daughter, so they are another generation along. And we have those handouts for you. You put a common ancestor, and then you work each direction. Next slide. Okay, now, brick walls. How are we going to knock them down, particularly the 1870 brick wall? How are you going to get back past 1870 if your people were enslaved? There are some ways. Let's look and see what we have. Next slide. Okay, so wills and probate papers. If you are researching a county that's not what we call a burned county, and I don't know much about Gloucester, King and Queen is a burned county, courthouse burned in 1864, so we're not going to get those estate papers. We get them in Essex, we get them in Richmond County, in Westmoreland County, and so if you have estate papers, you may be able to find your family, particularly if it says, my Negro woman Sue and her children, Jen, Sam, and Bob. And if you know you have those names in your family and you're looking in the area where you think your family might have been enslaved, then you may be able to find them. But sometimes you see surnames, but mostly not. But you may find them. And it is kind of makes you pause when you learn that when that state appraisal was done, that your ancestor was worth $800, or maybe even only 200 if they were elderly. Next slide. Another Freedmen's Bureau. Kim Kane, when we were indexing the Freedmen's Bureau records, he was governor. He called the Freedmen's Bureau the FEMA of its time, because there was chaos. And so the Freedmen's Bureau, in its short-lived history, came in to try to, federal agency, to make some sense of the chaos. And one of the things they did most importantly is the cohabitation records. And so you got folks who are married to folks who are in domestic partnerships, marital relationships, whatever, no record. So people were to come in and register. And when they did, they say, I'll say it, my name is Bessida White, I've been married to this man for 56 years, and we have children, whatever, and I say who my last enslaver was, I say where I was born, all this wonderful, wonderful information. So if your jurisdiction has the cohabitation records, I mean, they are, I've researched, I see Caroline County has its, Richmond County, Westmoreland County, and I was doing a project researching the people enslaved at Minocin in Richmond County, and the cohabitation records were practically the only way we had of finding out who was enslaved. And of course, with that, we know who the owners of the land were during a particular time. So you're looking to see who those people enslaved. Another place you might look is the Slave Birth Index, which is another source, and sometimes you have names or enough information that you can make sense of. But so they are absolutely wonderful. They do not exist, I don't think, for Gloucester County. And I remember years ago seeing some Gloucester records before these records were indexed, from National Archives and Family Search. I thought, where are those Gloucester records? But what I found is there is a Gloucester list that comes from Record Group 105, which is Freedmen's Bureau. There is a Gloucester list of freedmen's marriages. Are you all familiar with that? I'll share it with you, but it's not the cohabitation list, but like I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew this thing existed, and when you go on, most of the cohabitation records are either at Library of Virginia or they're on Family Search, one or the other. And I finally got the Gloucester records. Next slide, move quickly. And this is just a detail that shows you ages, last enslaver, and that's a transcription that shows you and what those cohabitations, and those are on Library of Virginia's website, so you can access them on. And you always want to look back at the original because they may not have been transcribed properly. The transcribers may not have been familiar with that surname, and you're familiar with the surname, so you can tell what it's trying to say. Okay, Civil War pension files. There were so many folk who were in the United States Navy and the United States Colored Troops. But this man says, I was born in the year of 1834 in the state of Virginia. My owner was Lawrence Harper of Guntsville, Virginia. I was sold by my owner and taken to Richmond, Virginia. And the traders taken me down to Vicksburg, Mississippi in the month of September 1859. And I was sold to Mr. John Willis there. I left a wife and child in Virginia. So just golden. I mean, that is in his, and he had joined the Navy in Mississippi, and I believe this man's name was Iverson Granderson. I believe that is a name that he assumed when he self-emancipated in Mississippi. There's no Grandersons. He was, enslaved by Harper. There's no Grandersons anywhere around. Some in Rifle County. I think he just, picked the name. But his great-granddaughter has some DNA matches in the Middle Peninsula. And then what I tried to do is find, he said he had a wife and a child. So in the 1860 slave schedule, Lawrence Harper enslaves an 18-year-old woman and a 2-year-old boy. That sounds awfully like his wife and child. And in the slave birth index, a woman whose name is Gloria, I think, who is enslaved by Lawrence Harper, gives birth to a boy that's given a name, and I don't remember, in 1858. So all I have is his first name. So I'm trying to find a woman with that first name in Essex County later that fits. And I'm pursuing several folks and haven't found them yet. But anyway, next slide, runaway lists. They actually list, now why would you want to pay taxes on something that you don't own anymore? You would want to do that. So if you indicate that your property has run away, then you might not be responsible, but runaway list. And the runaway list exists for some counties. Runaway list exists for Richmond County, which we found somebody who had run away from Noken. Runaway list exists for Essex County. There's one plantation that lost 50 people in one day. And that made me say, what on earth is going on here? How many people did they enslave? About 400. It was like a town, and that was up the county in Essex. The next slide. Over time. Freedmen's Bureau records, you never know, you have to keep looking. So I just did a search, which I've done, to tell you, when you do the same search because new records are being added. So I searched for Isabella White. I find Isabella, and I find Andrew, her husband, and I find the oldest 4 children. And I said, what is this list? It's just in the middle of pages and pages. I can't tell what it is. So I can see it's Freedmen's Bureau. I called a friend who's a Freedmen's Bureau expert. It was easier to call her than to try to figure it out. So she said these people are being transported from a contraband camp in Northern Virginia, out in the middle of the Potomac River, which is Mason's Island, it was called. It's now Roosevelt Island. And there was a contraband camp there, and for whatever reason, June 7th, 1865, they are in the contraband camp and being transported to Fort Monroe, working their way back to King and Queen Courthouse. And all I know is by a year from then, they're back in King and Queen, that they can be a founder of Zion Baptist Church. But, why they were there, I had this oral history that said they were free before the Civil War. They must have been. I mean, why are you in Northern Virginia in a contraband camp, you know, April, May, June, 2 months after the war ended, trying to get back home? What is going on? I don't know. Next slide, moving very quick. Books and manuscripts, you may get lucky. There is a book that a white preacher, born about 1840, I guess, wrote in the 1920s, Reverend Bagg, the King and Queen History. And he's got one chapter on the good Negroes. And he does a paragraph on about 8 of them. Well, I'm lucky enough that the first one is my step-grandmother's grandfather, Osborne Bowler. And the second one, Tolliver Ross. You know, we say Taliaferro, and we generally spell it that way. White folks say Tolliver oftentimes, and sometimes spell it that way. But Taliaferro Ross, so it says my great-grandfather, says who his enslaver was, says who his wife's enslaver was, Colonel Pollard. And the interesting thing about that I end up relating to all of Colonel Pollard's relatives. So I'm assuming that either Colonel John Pollard or his brother or his son or somebody fathered my great-grandmother. Anyway, next slide. I'm going to wind this down. Okay, Virginia Baptist Historical Society Church Records. This is an example of what you can find, and they are not automated. They really haven't gotten quite to the 21st century yet. So you have to go there and see what they have. And they just started allowing you to even, you know, make a copy. It's like you were sitting writing. Anyway, so what I find is folks who were enslaved by Richard Henry Harwood, who owned Minoka. And so this is how I get these folk who were in the web, because my goal is to find people enslaved in Minoka. So here they are listed. And so you may find wonderful records at the Virginia Baptist Historical Society, which is located on the campus of the University of Richmond. The good thing about it, you call Darlene Herod, I think her name is, and she will tell you what she's got from your county. And so at least you'll know. Well, now I was just, we just did a highway marker yesterday for Antioch and Saluda, and it came out of Clark's Neck Baptist Church, now Saluda Baptist. Those records for the relevant period of time, 1866, are just not there. So sometimes they are, sometimes they are. Next slide. Okay, don't believe everything you read. Sometimes the stories are true, sometimes they're not. Usually there's a little bit of truth there. Listen to oral histories. The names. I have some second cousins whose name is Dungy, and they spell it D-U-N-G-E. There's 6 different spellings. So, you know, sometimes people who went north, I've got a Bond family, B-A-U-G-H, B-A-U-G-H-A-N. The ones that went north put the A-N, the ones that stayed south, I mean, and first names may vary as well. And one of the things I like to use is timelines. When you get the same names used again and again, you're going to get yourself all tied up if you can't get that into a timeline and see that this couldn't possibly be that Daniel Gordon, because this one died. You know, the math ain't mathing, so use timelines. Next slide. Don't assume that your family took the name of the last slaveholder. Family Search says that only about 15% of enslaved black folk took the name of the last enslaver. And I mean, they should know they do this. I kind of think that's a little low. I think maybe 1/4 did, but I think we all agree most did not take the name of them. Sometimes they had the name of an earlier enslaver. And sometimes we don't know. I mean, there's nobody named White. No white people owned land in King and Queen County when the Civil War ended. So where did my family get that name? Why would you pick that name? Don't know. Anyway, let's see. Don't forget fan club. Go back one again. Just friends, family, associates, neighbors. You got to research other people. Maybe if you can't find your family because their name was so horribly spelled or so horribly transcribed, if you know who the neighbors are, maybe, now I found, and I'll say this, I found an enslaver for my great-great-grandmother by researching not my great-grandfather, but his brother. His brother was an attorney in Maryland, in Baltimore. There's a 1900 article in the newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, that says that Hezekiah White represented this white man who was charged with forgery or something, and he pleads insanity. And the article goes on to say that Hezekiah White's mother was enslaved by this man's family in King and Queen County before the Civil War. The man's name is John Mitchell, and he was a Confederate soldier. So after all those years, I found that enslaver. Next slide. Oh, and you know, your family may be listed as white one time, they may be listed as black, they may be listed as mulatto. You know, don't pay much attention to that. It may be transcribed wrong. In other words, if you look, so that's why you always want to go back and look at the original document, because it may clearly say colored, but they put white when they transcribe. So there's so much out there. It's a wonderful time to be doing this work. Institutes, webinars, conferences. The Midwest African American Genealogy Institute is held each summer. You can do it online, or you can do it in person. They do it in at the Allen County Public Library in whichever Midwestern city I'm spacing on it now. Anyway, Roots Tech is free, largest genealogy conference in the world. If you can do it in person in Salt Lake, but you might pay $1,000 a night for a room, or you can do it online. So much out there, so much, you're just overwhelmed, even the free stuff. I mean, it's more than you can possibly do. Join your local historical society, join an African American Genealogy Society. I brought brochures from our group. We meet virtually on the second Saturday in each month. And in this rural area, people find their relatives all the time. It is just phenomenal. Somebody looks over and says, wait a minute, aren't you Jeannie Girl on Ancestry? And somebody will say, yeah, well, you're my cousin. You know, it happens in this rural area all the time. There are so many Facebook groups, and I believe on your handout, I put, you know, you can join a Facebook group of people who are Ancestry.com users. You can join a Facebook group that says Family of Middlesex, Matthews, and Gloucester. That's African Americans researching this area. You can join, I mean, just so many subject matter. DNA Facebook group. There's a Facebook group of DNA detectives, people trying to find birth parents. And so so much information. Next slide. Get started, be intentional about it, don't drag your feet like I did. Join the Genealogy Society, make sure you get your DNA done. Do every online session you can do. There's just so much out there. Participate in the Facebook groups, and then start your own library, electronically and hard copy. And do enjoy it, but it can be addictive, I have to warn you. It really, really can be addictive. And you can say, get up off the computer and go to bed and sleep out the morning. Okay, I think we are done. So we probably have 4 or 5 minutes for questions.